Hello, folks, and welcome to History's Devils, a podcast journey through the lives of murderers, charlatans, psychopaths, and shitheels. My name is James Crossland. I'm a professor of international history. And on the first episode of History's Devils, I said this was not going to be the Hitler show. I made a promise to you that this was not going to be Nazi of the Week. I never said, however, that we wouldn't be dabbling in some Hitler-adjacent people. And our subject today is about as Hitler-adjacent as you can get. He was the secretary of the Nazi Party. He was the Deputy Führer of the Third Reich. He was, by the accounts of some historians, the closest thing that Adolf Hitler had to a friend, other than his dog Blondie, of course. And yet, this man threw it all away in May of 1941 at the height of the Second World War by flying to Scotland with the idea of forming an alliance, or at least an understanding, between Britain and Germany by the means of a so-called British peace party of elites who were prepared to either make peace with Germany and perhaps even overthrow Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The man in question is Rudolf Hess, and joining me today to discuss how he went from second man in the Third Reich to this bizarre object of Second World War curiosity and the source of countless conspiracy theories, I am joined by the D-Day historian and host of World War II TV, Paul Woodadge. Paul, welcome to History's Devils.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
So the first question I got to ask is Rudolf Hess, as a guy who knows a thing or two about the Second World War. When I say Rudolf Hess to you, what comes into your mind? What do you know about this guy just instinctively?
Well, the real me thinks of, Wild Geese 2, played by Laurence Olivier, crackpot, conspiracy theory, all that kind of stuff. But then if I put my historian hat on, of course, I realize he is much more nuanced than that to some degree, although he clearly is bonkers. But I think despite my knowledge, the overwhelming amount of data and information about him is of the kind of conspiratorial, batshit crazy theories, all that kind of stuff. So what I know and what I think I know, they're different, but there's an overlap.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. He's a man of many parts. He does have this duality where on the one hand, he's this incredibly important figure in the Third Reich. On the other, he's someone who, to be honest, he exists on the fringe of history. He's a footnote in a lot of books about the Second World War, and he's kind of been confined to books about just his flight and the various theories about it. The thing about him, I think, that marginalizes him is that because he literally flees the Third Reich in 1941, he's not there when the Holocaust happens. He's not there for Barbarossa and the whole disaster on the Eastern Front and the barbarity of that. And compared to people like Himmler, Goering, Reinhard Heydrich, he seems like an almost quaint, somewhat eccentric guy. And as we'll get into, he's even painted by some people as a victim.
Yeah.
When we get into the Cold War, because he dies in 1987. He's 93 years old. He's imprisoned in Spandau prison for a good number of decades by himself. And he becomes this almost sympathetic figure, like this weak old man. And how could you possibly see him as this Nazi war criminal? And the problem is that he was a bastard, right? He was a firm believer in Hitler's genocidal plans. And despite flying to Scotland on a so-called peace mission, this guy was not a pacifist, right? He didn't want to end the war. He wanted to change the alliance structure of the war and bring Britain into the Nazi fold. So he's not some clueless puppy, and to understand the reasons why he flew to Scotland, the true nature of Rudolf Hess has to be appreciated. And that is what we are going to provide on this episode of History's Devils. So let's get into the man himself. Rudolf Hess was born in Alexandria, Egypt in 1894. He was raised in a very Anglo-centric environment. Egypt's been under effective British control since the early 1880s. There's a large British diaspora there. This is important because that means Hess grows up with this appreciation of Britain and its empire. He's also very big on Germany, though, as well. Like his future best mate, Adolf Hitler, who was, of course, born in Austria, Hess being born outside Germany's borders means that he's going to be one of these people who becomes more German than the Germans. And when the First World War breaks out in 1914, although he's on the cusp of entering the family business, his dad was a pretty successful import-export guy, patriotism overcomes him, and he decides that Germany is being wronged by the Entente, And so he joins the army to fight for the fatherland. By all accounts, he is a brave soldier. He's very competent. He serves in France and in the Balkans. He takes a bullet through the chest in Romania, shrapnel wounds as well, for which he receives the Iron Cross. He is revered by his comrades, but when you look at contemporary accounts of him here, you can see he's already being seen as a bit of a weirdo by people. He's very serious. I'm going to put up a picture of him here, and this is the classic picture. It's Hess in his Nazi guise, but these massive furry eyebrows staring at you. He's a serious man. He is not a hit at parties. He is very taciturn. He's very quiet, and he has a budding interest in this time in spiritualism as well, which again puts him in an eccentric category. And he fantasizes a hell of a lot about flying. He's one of these flying romantics, the marvelous men in their flying machines. And wouldn't it be wonderful to, command the skies and all that stuff? And so when he's wounded in Romania, he's convalescing in a hospital bed. He starts thinking to himself, I want to be a knight of the air. And he joins the German Air Force, in reward for which he gets about a week or so of active flying at the tail end of the war, and then the armistice happens, and that's the end of that. So for that reason, and for the wider reason that the war is obviously ended not in Germany's favor, he's one of these guys at the end of the war, these veterans of the war, who is listless, who is angry. He believes wholeheartedly in the Deutschlandlegende, the stab in the back myth, the idea that Germany's not defeated in the field. The reason why we lost is because of the Bolsheviks and the Jews and the pacifists and everything else. He enrolls in the University of Munich in 1919 with an aim to basically move on with his life and try to distract himself from all the despair he feels at the way the war ended. And it's there that he meets a beacon of light in the darkness of his post-war depression, a man by the name of Karl Haushofer. I'm going to put up a picture here of the two of them. Haushofer is this guy who you really need to understand him to understand where the Nazi mind comes from. He is incredibly influential. He is the father of geopolitics, which today is a pretty well-recognized discipline, the idea that geography determines the fate of nations. If you're a small island nation with no natural resources, like, for example, Britain, you need to go out and carve an empire in order to be great, that sort of thing. And when Haushofer is teaching this stuff, he's teaching it in a way that applies specifically to Germany. And he's saying, that the problem is Germany needs to expand. It needs land. It needs resources. It needs Lebensraum, which living space, which anyone who knows anything about the Second World War knows that is fundamental belief of Hitler's ideology and the guiding principle of why he's going into the Soviet Union to extend the land and power of the Reich. So Hitler becomes as much a disciple of Haushofer and his beliefs as Hess does. At the same time that Hess is drinking Haushofer's Kool-Aid, he's also getting deep into something called the Fuhrer Society. You heard of them, Paul? Fuhrer Society?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, I mean they are fundamental for understanding the more esoteric and occult areas of Nazi belief. They're established in 1918 as a group who are all about basically promoting the Aryan race, very big on this idea that the German Aryan peoples are descendants of this master race, which existed in a place called Ultima Thule, an ancient northern kingdom that has been lost to history. This is Atlantis, knowledge of the ancients shit, infused with racial politics. And Hess loves it. He buys into it 110%. More practically, at the same time, he also joins the Freikorps, this extreme right-wing paramilitaries who are going around beating up communists at a time when Germany looks like it is falling into a full-blown communist revolution at the end of the war, kind of extension of what happens in Russia in 1917. So he's a busy boy during this period. And he meets two more fateful people at this time. One is the woman he will marry in 1927, Ilse Voll, who becomes the love of his life. And the other is the other love of his life, Adolf Hitler, whom he first encounters in the spring of 1920, when he and Haushofer go to a meeting of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, what is going to become the Nazis, to hear this guy speak. And I mean, it's because Hitler is he's the hot ticket in town, right? He's the one everyone's talking about. You got to go see this funny little Austrian guy get on a beer hall table and harangue you about the ills of Germany. And The fact that Hitler's able to turn the politics of grievance into this sweet, angry song, this is music to Hess's ears. He hears what Hitler's saying. He's taken in by it, hook, line, and sinker. He sees, like a lot of men in his position, veterans of the First World War, he sees in Hitler someone who is going to provide snappy answers to all these complex questions. And that makes him an ideal Nazi. And that's why he's there when the beer hall push takes place on the 8th of November 1923 in Munich. This attempt by the Nazis to seize power, it's a complete and total fiasco. 4 of their number are killed. Many others are wounded and arrested. Hess himself is one of them. After he attempts to flee to Karl Haushofer's house, he's arrested, and he quite gladly does time with Hitler in Landsberg prison. And it's here that he plays his first really important role in forming what is going to become the Third Reich, when he allegedly contributes to the writing of Mein Kampf. Different historians have got different views on this, whether he actively writes sections of it or whether he just edits it. If it is that he just edits, then amongst his myriad other crimes, he should have probably just been hanged for this. Because if you've ever tried to read Mein Kampf, oh boy, if there was ever a book in need of a fucking editor.
It's a terrible book in both definitions of the word terrible. I mean, badly written and awful in terms of its message. But
absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I tried to read it the first. I was like, oh my God, how did people get swept away by this? So awful.
It's bizarre because it's repetitive, isn't it? Like, quite apart from the content. The content is like, you can read the first 5 pages and be like, yep, I got it. Don't need the rest.
Yep.
So maybe Hess is responsible for that. We don't know. What we do know is that he certainly agreed with everything in Mein Kampf. He's there helping Hitler put it together. And that means that they form a bond in Landsberg, which really is quite substantial. As I said before, the argument that Hess is Hitler's only real friend really comes from this moment. They are attached at the hip from here on out. Hess becomes the warm-up guy at Nazi rallies, which is an interesting thing to consider, because, as I say, he's not the life of the party, but he can parrot the lines if he's given them. I think that's his utility there. So he's the warm-up guy. He's the chief paper shuffler. He's the Nazi party secretary. He organizes all the stuff, and he also becomes the gatekeeper to Hitler within the Reich leadership, which is a really important point, because the way that the Reich is eventually governed and the way the Nazi party is governed until 1933 when they take power belies this myth that they are some sort of, bureaucratic juggernaut. They are an absolute shit show. It's basically everyone swanning around trying to curry favor with Hitler. And Hess has got the important role of figuring out who's going to talk to Hitler. So that's a really quite vital role in the development of the Third Reich and the way it's going to function. He's also more important, I think it's important to mention, to the Nazi consolidation of power than most people think. He is instrumental in drafting the Nuremberg laws in 1935, which put into law a range of restrictions on what Jewish people can and cannot do in the Third Reich. It's a stepping stone on the road of persecution that will end in the death camps. So this idea that because he's not there for the Holocaust means he's not complicit, bullshit. He's there working towards it from the very start. He's also key to the Nazi plan to identify ethnic Germans across Europe. This is a big part of Hitler's grand strategy, bringing people home to the Reich so we can create this folk, this united people. Hess runs the office in charge of that. So again, whilst he seems like this peripheral figure, he's actually laying the foundations for what's going to lead to some of the grossest crimes of the Nazi regime. But whilst he's doing these very serious, very intense things, he's also getting even deeper into the weirdness, the occult stuff. He's still reveling in it. And he's really not well liked in the Nazi leadership. He's basically the oddball amongst oddballs. So in addition to still banging on about ancient civilizations and Aryan brotherhoods and all this shit, he also becomes quite notorious for having a very bespoke diet. He's a fastidious vegetarian, organic food only, has to be prepared a certain way by certain people. He's that guy who brings his own food to parties. He's that guy. And today he would be that guy buying all the overpriced biodynamic whatevers at Whole Foods. He's that guy. Very, very progressive in that respect, in terms of sort of middle-class tastes. He's also a germaphobe. He's prone to fits of anxiety, and social awkwardness is his byword. He probably has some kind of anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, maybe, I don't know. But he's a very anxious, very tense guy. He does not make friends. And he's also about as politically savvy as a plank of wood. He doesn't understand that Shark Tank politics of the Reich and of the Nazi leadership. He doesn't understand that you need to play the game a bit in the way that people like Goering do, and Himmler to an extent does, and various others. He's also not a war guy. He's a bureaucrat. So when Hitler, after the consolidation of power is complete in the mid-1930s, when he starts talking about what we're going to do next, how this war that we want is going to start, Hess gets pushed to the side. And I got a quote here from Hitler that I think really sums it up. This is from, I think, 1936. Hess is tiring to listen to, but when I get out of a talk with Goering, I feel like I've bathed in steel. It's typical Hitler hyperbole, but because, I mean, Goering's in charge of the Luftwaffe, right? He's a guy that Hitler can sit down with and talk about, how many planes are we producing and all this real stuff. What are our oil supplies? How many bullets do we have? All this. Hess doesn't know any of this shit. And he doesn't really care. He's busy being a party functionary. And even that aspect of his career, he loses, because that the ostracization, the fact that he is being increasingly unpopular, not just with the leadership, but also with Hitler, means that he is ultimately pushed out of the position of gatekeeper by Martin Bormann, one of the most accurately named men in the Third Reich. Because he's just a Billy No-Face. He is even more of a blank slate than Hess is, devoid of all that esoteric stuff as well. He's not seen as a weirdo. He's just seen as this dull bureaucrat. And Hitler loves him. He thinks he's the bee's knees at a time when Hess is becoming increasingly ostracized. So by the time we get to the war breaking out in 1939, Hess is really on the outs, but he still desperately wants to serve his Führer. And this is the status he's in when the war really ramps up in 1940. So for the benefit of folks who don't fully understand what's happening at this time, Paul, do you want to just outline what's the strategic situation for Germany and for Britain in 1940?
Well, 40 is very distinctly different to 1941, which we'll get to later on, and the actual flight to England, because 40 is in some ways about bravado still. The chess pieces haven't quite been put on the chessboard yet. That doesn't really happen until the end of 1941. I want to get into that later on. 42, I'm skipping around a bit, is the year of turning points, and everybody's in who's going to be in now. The sides have all been picked up. But 40 has been kind of speculative, lots of promises. We Brits grew up with the idea of the phony war and things like that. The Battle of Britain has ended successfully, although it's actually, from the German point of view, morphed into the Blitz, whereas the British and the Commonwealth have like a definitive date for the end of the Battle of Britain. The Germans don't see it as the failure of an offensive operation in the air. They see it as a morphing into a strategic bombing situation. So 1940 is the rallying cry. It's Churchill sending out his message about, we want to have commando troops, we want to do this, we want to send a message out to the world. Lots of discussions about who from which nation are going to be taking part in the war, in what role. At this point, the USSR and Germany have this alliance that we now realize wasn't worth the paper it was written on in terms of the contract, but that it's about perceptions. I think when we get into 1941 particularly, the perception at the time is very different to how we as historians look at what was going on, with the benefit of all the hindsight we have. So uncertainty in the beginning of 1941, having gone from this sort of, as I say, this rallying cry of 1940, and there'd been the initial, the German pushes to the fall of France, etc., and Denmark and Norway and things like that, the incursion into North Africa, the Battle Atlantic is raging. The first happy time, as we call it, in terms of the U-boat war, began around May, June 1940. And some people say it was over by December 1940. Other people say it was still going on till sort of April 1941. There's a second happy time coming later on. So I think 1940 is interesting because we look back at, for example, both what Churchill was saying and people like Hitler were saying, but half of what they were saying was based on the hope that something would happen rather than necessarily knowledge it was happening. Churchill's "we will fight them on the beaches." It sounds brilliant, but it's sort of an act of I'm not going to say a desperate man, but he's in a situation where he doesn't really know what the future is going to be. And it is looking very, very bleak for the Allies in 1940, right through to the summer of 1941. As yet, the USA are not involved. There's lots of uncertainty about where Yugoslavia is going to come into the war effort, North Africa, the Middle East, going into Iraq, things like that. What's going to happen there? Africa. It's a very complicated
It's all
era.
to play for, isn't it?
It's all to play for, yeah. It's the early rounds of the cup to some extent. And some of the teams are going to go on a cup run and still be in the competition later, and some are not going to get knocked out in the early rounds. And
exactly.
It's interesting. But I think when we get to 1941, that's the timing of Hess's flight is, I think, what adds so much to this whole what was going on, because we can look at the dates, but there's a factual framework that you can examine. But what you'll never be able to understand is motivation. And I want to take it back to what you said. I know I'm bouncing around with the conversation about Hess, and I feel that in the 20s and 30s, to give it an analogy, he's like that kind of flat earther or something, who's fine when it's 2 or 3 flat earthers meeting in the pub, and they trust each other explicitly, and they agree explicitly and completely about what they want. But as soon as they go to organize their first conference, and more flat earthers come in, some of whom maybe aren't quite as fervent about the flat earth aspect, but they're very good at organizing, Hess finds himself being pushed out of that. Because as you say, when we talk about the Nazis, we talk about how much did they buy into the ideology. Now, whether or not he contributed fully to Mein Kampf, he is definitely part of the creation of the ideology. He's not buying into it as others did. He is absolutely part of the inception, if you like, of what it is all about, particularly, as you said there, the anti-Slavic thing. Not saying he isn't also anti-Semitic, but it's the Slavic thing, because he sees where others are fervently more about race and identity. As you said, he sees it far more about the geopolitical situation. Even though he's not very good at that, he's got enough vision to understand that eradicating the Jewish population doesn't give you a territory, does it? Whereas the Slavic policy, absolutely, if you push east as they did, that absolutely expands the German empire.
And that's born of the Haushofer stuff, the concept of Lebensraum, which is kind of his starting point for getting into all this. And as you say, I mean, the flat earther analogy is perfect, because it's that thing where he's kind of in a self-contained little fantasy world. Yeah. But then when reality comes into it and new ideas come into it, and the situation around him changes, he's left hanging on the street while everyone else is going into the house to party. And that party is going to be the invasion of the Soviet Union. Yeah. But as I say, in 1940, we're not there yet. And it's really important to keep that in mind, that our hindsight tells us that we know what's going to happen. But this idea that that the war is going to shape out the way it does, that is not certain at all. France has fallen. That's certain. Churchill has come into power. That is certain. But whether he's going to hold on to power, that is very uncertain. Absolutely. And what the implications are for him losing power is also throws up a plethora of possibilities. And we've discussed this in a previous episode of History's Devils about the so-called British Peace Party of the 1930s. Check that out if you haven't already. But there is this idea floating around, and it's been floating around since the era of appeasement, that Britain and Germany should be friends, that there's no reason they should fight, and that their natural enemy is the Soviet Union. Now, what's most heinous about this, and what I discussed in this previous episode, was that there are members of elite circles in Britain, members of the House of Lords, sitting MPs, people who've influenced former military, who do still believe into 1939, 1940, that an accord with Germany is the desired outcome of this, and that is the only way, perhaps, to preserve the British Empire. And this is where Churchill is so important, because although he does, despite the myths, and we love the myths, and they're great, but he does consider it when it's put before him that, we could try to broker a peace. It's not something he completely rejects out of hand, although he does eventually rise above it. But it's a very tenuous situation for what Britain's going to do in the summer and into the fall of 1940. And Hess is one of these people who clings to this idea that this peace party is not only as powerful as it was and influential as it was before Churchill, which is not true. When Churchill comes in, one of his first orders of business is to actually strip a lot of these peace seekers from positions of power. Most notably of all, he sends Lord Halifax, who was the sort of arch appeaser in cabinet, sends him off to the United States to become ambassador as far away from the action as humanly possible. But Hess, to your point about the flat earth thing, he is still working on kind of old information, and he believes that there's this secret clique of anti-Churchillites who are not only still in positions of power, but who are waiting for some kind of grand overture from Hitler for peace. And there had been some peaceable missions, which again I discussed in a previous episode. Goering in particular shepherds a number of emissaries to Britain in 1939 and into early 1940, trying to make peace. But these all flounder basically on the rocks of British, even people who want an accord with Germany. Most Britons are looking at Hitler and going, no way with this guy in power, because he has torn up pretty much every agreement he's ever signed. We cannot trust him. So those negotiations are going nowhere. But the romantic idea of an Anglo-German brotherhood marching in lockstep against the hated Slavs of the East, that is something that Hess is going to cling to like a drowning man to a plank of wood. You know, that is going to be his thing.
I think you're right about the 1940 thing. I mean, I think going back to sort of 37, 38, I think a lot more people in Britain would have been at least open to the idea of the possibility of some future that doesn't involve conflict, having only had the First World War one generation earlier. And I think once the fall of France has happened, once those countries have gone, I think the realization that Hitler is not someone to be trusted. And although we often bask in this idea that nobody knew about the Holocaust till much later in the war. Well, I mean, we did a show on my channel about the amount of press attention that the opening of Dachau and things like that got, years before World War II. The idea that the British public, the American public, had no idea about the full extent of the ambitions of the Third Reich in terms of the ideology is nonsense. People may be choosing not to be aware of it, choosing not to look, choosing not to read information, but that was definitely there. But I think by 1940, the idea that there's going to be a successful alliance built between Britain and Germany is in the minds of a few deluded people, one of whom clearly is Hess.
Yeah. And that's a really good point, that it's only a few people. I mean, these people still exist, and there are genuine pro-Nazis in Britain, but they're marginal and they don't have a whole lot of power. And the important thing to make here point about Hitler in all this, which I think needs to be emphasized, is that we have this idea of Hitler, and that scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark has a lot to blame for this. Hitler's obsessed with the occult, and he's this flaky esoteric whack job. That's not true at all. Hitler was actually a lot more pragmatic than I think people give him credit for, and particularly at this time, like I say, he's worried about tank production, and he's worried about how many men the Hungarians can give him to invade the Soviet Union. He doesn't want to hear Hess's bleating on about, but the British are our brothers and we must blah 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 and all this Toolist Society stuff. He doesn't want to hear it, because he understands that the strategic situation is that we're not going to bring Britain to the table anytime soon. And we just have to crack on. We just have to. The goal is to destroy the Soviet Union. And although there's this whole thing about never fight a war on two fronts, Hitler is bound and determined to launch Operation Barbarossa in 1941. And it's that fear of what's going to happen when he launches it without his flank protected, his western flank protected, without Britain at ease. That's what leads Hess to start thinking to himself, well, I've got to do something about it. And in the process become the hero to my Führer. And it's this imperative that leads him in August of 1940 to start meeting with not just Karl Haushofer, but his son Albrecht, who is also very into all this Anglo-German brotherhood stuff. And it's a discussion with them that becomes quite fateful. They talk to Hess about how they have received a letter from a lady by the name of Violet Roberts, who's a British acquaintance of theirs, who is also an acquaintance of someone called the Duke of Hamilton, who was a member of the Anglo-German Fellowship, which was this society that was formed in the mid-1930s to try to strengthen ties between Britain and Germany. By the time the war breaks out, it's kind of fallen by the wayside, because obviously you don't want to be talking about being friends with Germany when you're at war with them. But some of its membership, and again, I talked about this on a previous episode, some of its membership are quite moderate. They're just people who, as you say, just want to avoid war because they've got the memory of the First World War in mind.
Yeah.
Some of them are foam at the mouth anti-Semitic Nazis who would love to see the swastika flying from the Houses of Parliament. So there's a range of membership there. Hamilton is more on the moderate side. And by the time the war starts, he's not really playing with the idea of being friends with the Germans anymore. But Hess, again, working from old information, he's now got a conduit via Violet Roberts, who he can send a communique to Hamilton. He believes Hamilton is connected to this secret clique of anti-Churchillites. And so he says to Albrecht Hallschoffer, send Violet Roberts a letter to forward this on to Hamilton, suggesting that Albrecht and Hamilton in particular meet in some neutral country to discuss the Anglo-German crisis. And this letter is sent on the 23rd of September, 1940. Now, this letter does not reach its destination for a good couple of months because it's intercepted by MI5 censors. This letter was sent via Portugal. So if something's coming from a neutral country, by and large, it's gonna get put through the censors, and they hold on to that letter, they being MI5, until April 1941. Now, this is one of the well springs of the conspiracy theories. Why are British intelligence sitting on this letter? What is it? We know from actual evidence, declassified files, MI5 is moving officers at this time. This letter falls into some storage box somewhere. No one looks at it. There's nothing really, I mean, it seems sketchy, but there's nothing actually sketchy going on. This is just an administrative fuck up. And they find the letter in April 1941. But here's the thing. By then, Hess has not received a reply. So we've got these months where Hess is just kind of hanging, waiting for a reply from Hamilton. It doesn't come. And this is where the dreamer in him takes hold. He decides, I haven't had a response to this letter, but you know what? I need to do something. Barbarossa is on the agenda. It's going to be kicking off pretty soon. I need to do something to bring peace between Britain and Germany. And so he decides to start training for this flight. He works out of the aerodrome in Augsburg, does a few training flights, starts modifying the plane, puts extra fuel tanks on it. His goal is to fly to Dungavel House, which is just south of Glasgow, and it's the seat of the Duke of Hamilton. To fly there on an overnight flight, no one will detect him. He's going to land. It has its own landing strip. He's going to land there. He's going to talk to Hamilton. Hamilton's going to put him in communication with the secret anti-Churchill clique, and the wheels are going to start moving. And this is what leads, and I'm just going to go through facts here before we get into theories. The facts of what happens is this. He sets off from Augsburg Aerodrome at 5:45 p.m. on the 10th of May, 1941. He's in a Bf-110E. It's been modified with larger fuel tanks. He is picked up by the RAF monitoring, and I'm just going to put up a picture here of his flight path. It's quite an interesting flight path, as we'll get to. But he's picked up by RAF monitoring station just south of Newcastle at about 10 o'clock in the evening. They scramble planes to track him. He's given the code of Raid 42. That's how his plane is known. He manages to evade these planes that are sent up to get him. The scrambling is not too scrambly. He overshoots Dungavel. He ends up getting to the Firth of Clyde, sees the sea and goes, oh shit, I've overshot things, turns around, tries to get back. By this time, he's run out of fuel. And here, this is quite extraordinary. This is a guy with quite limited flight experience. He's never parachuted before. He flips the plane upside down and he bugs out. Absolutely mad maneuver. He lands near Eaglesham by a parachute, which is about 12 miles outside Dungavel. It's a little village. Lands in a farmer's field, rolls his ankle on landing. I'll put up a picture here of what happens to his plane. Obviously, it crash lands and then the wreckage is scattered all over the shop. He is apprehended by the Home Guard. He tells them that his name is Captain Horn and that he has an important message for the Duke of Hamilton. He needs to see him immediately. This is the middle of the night, right? And this is all very fantastical. This is not what anyone was anticipating on this evening. So they're faced with this bizarre character calling himself Captain Horn. One of the Home Guard tweaks to the fact that for a lowly captain, he's got some really nice flight boots that have got, really nice wool-lined jobs, quality leather. And they also start looking at him and go, you know what? He looks an awful lot like the second most powerful man on paper, at least in the Third Reich. And so they figure out that it is Rudolf Hess. They call Hamilton. Hamilton gets out of bed. It's now well past midnight. Hamilton's pissed off because he's been hauled out of bed in the middle of the night. The next morning, Hamilton, along with Yvonne Kirkpatrick, who is a fluent German speaker from the Foreign Office, they are dispatched on the orders of Winston Churchill to interview this mysterious man to confirm that he is indeed Rudolf Hess. Hess then unleashes, I think it's 3 hours worth of verbal diarrhea on this
nonsense,
man.
Isn't it? Absolute nonsense.
it's a potted history of Anglo-German blood ties. It's a list of grievances for why the First World War was justified, why the current war is justified. It's Mein Kampf. He's doing Mein Kampf, basically, a recital. It's so bad that Kirkpatrick actually nods off at one point. He just can't stand it anymore, and he just flakes out. And for obvious reasons, Hamilton and Kirkpatrick get out of that meeting and go, yes, it's Rudolf Hess. And yes, he's mad as a balloon. He's talking about how he has a peace plan from Hitler. I should note here that although it is an essential part of some of the conspiracy theories, there's no evidence of Hess having an actual peace plan on paper. It's never been recovered. There's allegations that he had some piece of paper. The idea that it's on chancellery-headed notepaper and that it's signed by Hitler, that's all a bit fanciful. If you find a piece of paper, I'll look at it, but the piece of paper's never been found. So he's then made a prisoner of war, and we'll get into his incarceration in a minute. But that is the basic story, which then leads into, which obviously it's a story with a lot of holes in it. It's a story with a lot of gaps. And that's where we get the theories. Now, when I say, conspiracy theories about Rudolf Hess, anything pop into your head?
Well, when I was a kid, it was the fact that it wasn't even Hess. That was the big one that was doing the rounds then, is that it was somebody else. And that one, as you will explain, just endured until the mic drop, which was the DNA test, and he clearly was Hess. But I don't think when I was a lad, anyone cared about what his reason was for being there. Far more interesting to the general public was the idea that it was somebody else.
Because it's a mad idea.
Reaction. Yeah, because it's bonkers.
And it's such it's such an evocative idea. Basically, the body double theory is that the man who is imprisoned in Spandau prison until 1987 was not Rudolf Hess. And there's variations on this theory. One is that the real Hess is actually killed in a plane crash in 1942 whilst in British custody. Yeah. And that leads to a double swap. The other is that the man who flew wasn't even Hess. It was a double handpicked by Hitler. Leaving aside the fact that who in their fucking right mind would agree to that kind of mission to pretend to be Hess, who furthermore would sit in prison for decades, never telling anyone, oh, by the way, I'm not Hess.
How long might this last? This bloke answers an ad for volunteer wanted for covert thing. And he goes, how long might this last? Well, we're thinking it could be at least 50 years. Yeah. You go, no, thanks. I'm fine.
It's the sort of key to most conspiracy theories is, you ask the question why, and 99% of them unravel. And this is a case of that. So leaving aside the fact that, that makes no sense. As you say, there was a DNA test finally done in as late as 2019 to put this nonsense to rest, confirming that no, the man who dies in Spandau was indeed Rudolf Hess. So it's a stupid theory, but we have to entertain it just because, it's there.
And the theories of doubles just won't go away. I mean, it's a massive, great rabbit hole. But, there was the I Was Monty's Double film in the 50s, and the Eagle Has Landed. Jack Higgins was all about Churchill being a double. We're talking about today, Putin's doubles, Trump's doubles. Because it's a claim anyone can throw out without having to put anything in. You don't have to do any work to support that. You can just say, well, it's a double, isn't it? And people say, but there's no proof. Yeah, but they would say that. It's so easy to throw out there and just, pretend you've made some intelligent argument when in fact
non-falsifiable nonsense. And it makes for a cracking story. And that's I think the heart of this. So I have been fascinated by the flight of Rudolf Hess for the better part of 20 years. I've read all the books, good and bad, and there's a lot of bad. And I'm going to distill this down into three basic theories based on what I know. And there are variations of this theory, but ultimately it comes down to three. The first is the peace party theory. This is that the anti-Churchill clique is real. They knew that Hess was coming. They corresponded with him prior to the flight. There's even some versions of this where there's a preliminary meeting in Spain. Supposedly the landing lights are turned on at Dungavel in anticipation of him landing, but because he overshoots, he misses it. And basically the crux of this theory is that had he landed safely at Dungavel House and had the meeting, this would have all been apples. It would have been fine. But the fact he crash lands means that these guys go, oh shit, we need to go to ground. Hamilton is part of this, denies all knowledge of Hess, and the whole thing falls away. The evidence of this, there really isn't any. It's all circumstantial. It's Hamilton being a member of the Anglo-German Fellowship. It's stuff like, allegations that, as I say, the lights are turned on the landing strip at Dungavel that night. Again, these are sort of spurious things. They're not in terms of a historian's sort of burden of evidence, they don't really meet those requirements. And as I say, there are no peace plans recovered. Had there been official peace plans, then maybe there'd be something here where it's like, Hess this is a serious thing that where they've drawn up some agreement based on prior negotiations. But since there's never been that bit of paper saying that these are Germany's peace proposals to Britain and its empire, since all we've got is Hess's rambling, which just for the point of being thorough here, what Hess is promising is that Britain gets to keep its empire in return for giving Germany a free hand in the East. That's the basic premise of the peace, which is the same premise of most of the peace overtures that have been thrown out up until this point. Again, it's not written down, so it's not really real. So that's the peace party theory. The other is the lure theory, which is a lot more interesting, which is that the peace party is not real, but it's basically a double cross operation run by MI5's double cross committee. It's an attempt to try and lure Hess to Britain in order for, purposes unknown, to be perfectly honest. But the basis of this theory is that Albrecht's letter is actually used to contact Hess and lure him to Britain on the promise that, yes, this is all real. The evidence of this is kind of, there are layers to this. There was a book written in the early aughts that was based on what turned out to be forged documents that had been smuggled into the National Archives. And if you believe these forged documents, then this is real. There was this whole operation. It involved the Special Operations Executive as well. These documents you can now see at the National Archives in Kew. They are now part of the history itself. It was a big scandal at the time, actually, for the National Archives, because someone had smuggled these documents in. They're decent forgeries, but if you actually know something about the people and the players at this time and the situation, you read them and you go, hang on a minute, there's something dodgy about this. And mercifully, some good historians did that and alerted the National Archives, and that was that. So the main evidence is forged. The other bit of evidence that's perhaps interesting is that I mentioned before that the Albrecht's letter in response to Violet Roberts is intercepted by MI5, and they do actually meet with Douglas Hamilton, the Duke of Hamilton, on the 28th of April, because they uncover this letter, which is addressed to Hamilton. They say, hang on, this is kind of interesting. It seems like this German here wants to speak to you. We could use this for something. They summon him to a meeting. They say, how about you fly to Lisbon and you let's follow this lead and see where it goes. And Hamilton's very reluctant, but he agrees. But again, this is the 28th of April. This is barely a week before Hess arrives. So Hamilton never flies to Lisbon. The operation never happens. The next thing they know, Hess turns up and Hamilton's like, oh shit, what's going on, basically. The other interesting piece of evidence here is the way that Winston Churchill's secretary, Jock Colville, responds to Hamilton's phone call on the evening of the 10th of May saying, Hess has arrived. What the fuck do I do? And that's because Colville picks up the phone, and this is recorded in a few memoirs and diaries. He picks up the phone, and before Hamilton can speak, he says, has someone arrived? Now, Colville's excuse for this was that he had just finished reading a book called The Flying Visit by Ian Fleming, which was a fantasy book about Hitler parachuting into Britain. And he was having a vivid dream about this book when the phone rings. Interesting. I mean, again, it's a curious thing, but I don't think it proves that there was a massive MI5 SOE whatever plot to lure Hess. It perhaps at best points to the fact that someone in Britain may have known that someone was flying to Britain from Germany. That's me being generous. Yeah. I'm not sure what else to say about that. It's just a curious thing. But we're trying to be fair here. We'll throw it in the evidence pile for the lure theory. The problem, of course, is apart from the fact that there's never been any documentary evidence confirming, aside from the forged documents, that there was this plot, and a whole lot of stuff about the Hess flight has been declassified. Apart from that, what was the point of luring him?
That's my problem with it.
Yeah. What do they do with him?
I don't see an end game. I mean, when you look at MI5, MI9, they're all at that point. They've all got a very distinct, if you like, war-winning purpose behind them. You know, that everything that it has got. You know, the SOE set Europe ablaze. MI9 later on helping pilots get back to serve in the Air Force, escape underground, all those kind of things. Overthrowing governments. That they all have some kind of very concrete, if not sometimes ambitious and wildly ambitious. I have to think that the British government have realized by 1941 Hess is no longer as important as he had been. I don't see what, we hold up as the British government. So we've got Hess now, and Hitler goes, and what's the what?
Yeah,
what's the? I don't see.
That's a really good point, actually. The British government do realize the thing that Hess doesn't realize is that he's actually quite unimportant by this point. And that meeting with Kirkpatrick and Hamilton, it confirms it. Like it confirms what they already know, which is that this guy is just some, blithering idiot on the periphery of the Third Reich at this point. He's certainly not a serious person. The fact, as I say, that he's got no official communique from Hitler in hand furthers that image. The other thing about this, and there's been a lot of good research done on this by historians of propaganda, in particular the political warfare executive, there is a massive confusion when Hess arrives amongst the British propagandists over what to do with this guy. How do we spin this? And when you think about it, the Deputy Führer of the Third Reich has fled the coup. He's fled the sinking ship. There's an automatic story there they could have done, and they didn't do it. They didn't do shit with this guy in terms of propaganda because they couldn't figure out an angle. Now, if you went to all this trouble to lure him, surely you would have an angle pre-prepared.
Yeah.
Surely you'd have a purpose.
Unless, I'm supporting the theory, unless they realized that he is completely bonkers and whatever it was they thought they could use him for was impossible, and that we can bring him in to be some sort of senior advisor to the war cabinet or something like that about all things German. And they realize, oh my God, he's hopeless. I mean, I was going to make the point earlier that I think everybody, including Hitler, has realized that sometime earlier, Hess has overinflated his CV, basically. And I think Hitler perhaps sees him as this very internationally, globally minded guy. He's been around the world, but he understands different cultures. Is he kind of comfortably middle class? I don't know, sort of bridging different stratas of society. Mm-hmm. And once it gets beyond the 3 or 4 guys meeting in a pub, which I alluded to earlier, he suddenly becomes unable to participate. As you say, he can't deal with the Shark Tank, can't deal with the fact that there are meetings going on outside of his presence and people are much better at basically brown nosing in some ways and using the Third Reich for their own aspirations. That you can see that from Heydrich to Himmler to others, and Hess Hitler kind of realized all the things that perhaps he thought when they were confined in prison together. Hess talked a good talk, as Hitler did, but where Hitler was able to kind of put his talking through to something, Hess, it all unraveled. And I think there'd have been enough understanding from the British government that by this point that Hess has exaggerated everything, and he's got a name. Sure, he's the deputy leader, but
Yeah, he's not impressive.
How many of us can name deputy American vice presidents going back in the 20th century? A deputy it sounds like a high position, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're a mover and shaker. It doesn't. It's like assistant manager in football, adjutant to a regiment. It's seemingly an important role, and it does have an importance if you're the right kind of person. But it can also be like an honorary role, and things just happen around you. You're there on the minutes, but no one's actually expecting you to contribute.
Yeah, and I mean that sums him up. That is his status. He is that guy in the meetings who no one gives a shit about. Basically, he has to be there, and he gives it a bit of credibility because he's been in it. He's been in it since the beginning. He is a veteran Nazi by 1940-41. I mean, it's getting on for 2 decades. Where there are some OG. Yeah.
There's some fly-by-night people there who've been in for a few weeks and months, but yet they've managed to overtake in terms of influence, in terms of ability, in terms of what is his thing? As you say, he's not good at the military aspect. He's socially not particularly good. He's not particularly charismatic. He's not a great bureaucrat.
He'll make you a great biodynamic stew.
Exactly.
His worth is questionable, and as I say, that's the initial impression of him when he gets to Britain, and that sticks around, and that's a point that I think some of the more conspiratorially minded people sometimes forget, is that the British clock this guy. They're like, he's clearly past his prime. To put it politely, which leads us on to the final theory, which is the Madman Theory.
The bonkers one.
The bonkers one. So there's actually some ballast to this, and it basically is what I initially presented as the facts, which is that he doesn't get this letter. He's grown frustrated. He desperately still wants to make this grand gesture for peace, and so he gets in the plane and says, "Fuck it." Even if there's no one there, if I manifest, as the kids would say, if I manifest that there'll be a peace party there, it will be there when I get there. Basically, wing and a prayer stuff. Now there is some detail to this which I think is important. He meets with Albrecht just before he flies, and Albrecht tells him that on the 28th of April. He had a meeting in Geneva with a man by the name of Karl Burkhardt, who is the vice president of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Burkhardt is another conservative guy, wants the war to end. And he has a lot of contacts in Britain because he travels around a lot on account of his neutrality. And he says to Albrecht, I have English friends who are desperate for this war to end. Albrecht tells Hess this. And Hess interprets that as, there's a peace party and they're vibrant and they're organized and they're ready, and he runs with it. Now, this makes sense given what we know of Hess's state of mind, that he would cling to this really quite spurious piece of information and extrapolate from that there's an anti-Churchill conspiracy that's just waiting for someone from the Reich to turn up and say, yep, let's do this. This makes a lot of sense to me. And unlike the other two theories, there's actually evidence for this. There's evidence from diaries that this meeting between Burkhardt and Albrecht takes place. There's evidence that Albrecht meets with Hess and tells him this. It all adds up basically in terms of what we know about the sequence of events and in terms of Hess's personality. So that to me is the most convincing, and that you can modify aspects of it, but in terms of the evidence, that's the best thing we've got.
Yeah.
Sorry to all the flat earthers. Sorry to all the conspiracy theorists.
I'm with you. I think the bonkers one makes the most sense. But that said, I think there's elements of the first two in the lure theory. This is the era. 41 is the era of massive great decisions to make about, do we make carriers or do we make battleships? Do we make bombers? Do we make fighters? Where do we put our resources? I'm always thought about it on my channel about this is the era of you can't do everything at once. You've got three things that are priorities, but you've only got the funding and the material to do one of those three. So you've got it's gambling, it's betting with your mortgage on the fate. This is the decisions that are being made. To have some guy in an office, an MI5, just have a possibility of running this play in the background, just, leave a fishing line in the river and maybe something comes about it. But I don't think that there's any, effort being put. There's not big meetings. It's not massive resources. There's not 1,000 government officials all working. It's just some guy in an office just running it. And I think the Peace Party thing, I think when you were outlining that, obviously when we talk about the 1950s and 60s, this is the era of everybody who was part of the war effort, who was of a position of authority doing their memoir, be they a general, being they part of the war cabinet, whatever it would be, or they're still actually serving their country in whatever role they're doing. This is when all the, as you write about, all the people who are agents and resistance leaders all do their memoirs, because there's this sense of, I'm going to get mine in first so that I can say what really happened. Then now we're in there, people saying, well, when he said he did that, he didn't do all of that. So clearly, if there were some high-ranking British people, or even middle-ranking people who thought that there was some kind of peace deal on the cards, they're not going to be talking about it in the 1950s or 60s. They're going to be fully part of I gave my frying pan for Spitfires.
Yeah.
What? No, I thought there was a deal. No, I wasn't part of that. I mean, I have this conversation with Americans often about the fact that when American says to me, oh, we were behind you Brits in 1940, I go, no, you weren't. Some of you absolutely were, but your government was really, really sitting on a fence for a long time. FDR notwithstanding, and a lot of American people were like, well, let's just let this run and see what happens. This, and I think we can't deny the fact that there's an unmeasurable cross section of British people, British Empire people, who might have considered some kind of non-conflict base. I think after 1940, as I said, that's mostly gone away. But even in 1941, if you're a mum and your son is over in on a ship on his way to Africa, or your son's training, and he's talking about going to the Far East or something, maybe that you're thinking is there still a way, even at this late date, of pulling? So I feel that we can't completely dismiss, in a sense, one, but I still think it hasn't got any legs at all.
Yeah,
if I'm not contradicting myself.
That's the thing. I mean, we know that the intelligence services do some whack operations at this time, SOE especially, and we know that there were people in Britain who still wanted, as you say, not necessarily to march hand in glove with the Nazis, but to at least get Britain out of the war. But the structures that were in place for either of these groups to be connected to Hess, they don't seem to be there. The evidence doesn't lend it to that. It just seems like one big misunderstanding. But because of that, and because of the way in which he's imprisoned, these conspiracy theories continue. So I'll just go briefly through what happens to him afterwards. He becomes arguably the most high-profile, well, not arguably, he is the most high-profile prisoner of war that Britain has during the conflict. He is bounced around Tower of London, Mytchett Palace in Surrey. He ends up in a hospital in South Wales in mid-1942. He tries to kill himself on a couple of occasions. He really loses a lot of his fastidious habits. His mind does seem to go quite a bit. He starts ranting about how he's being poisoned by Jews, how Churchill is being controlled by a Jewish cabal, how there's psychic energy being used to unnerve him. He suffers from bouts of paranoia and crippling depression, which leads ultimately to the aforementioned suicide attempts. When he is finally put on trial at Nuremberg, he is out to lunch during proceedings. He is just not there. He claims he's got amnesia. Most people who examine him think he's putting it on. When he is sentenced to life imprisonment, he's not even there. He doesn't register it at all. As always, he is the kooky outsider. Even amongst the shitheels in the dock at Nuremberg, he is the guy who stands out as being completely out there. In Spandau Prison, Berlin, he becomes prisoner number 7. That is his designation. He is incredibly withdrawn from his compatriots who are in there with him. He doesn't allow his beloved wife Ilse or his son Wolf Rüdiger to visit him until 1969. And again, this has been ballast for some of the double theory people. He doesn't want them to see because they know him best. Nonsense. This man he is emotionally broken, and he is gnawing. The failure of his mission is gnawing at him. There's a repeated refrain, it seems, from the few people who talked to him at this time and managed to get some sort of conversation out of him. He is just despondent at how everything has turned out. He attempts suicide again in 1977, after which it's just him. By this stage, some of the Nazis have died who have been incarcerated, some have been released. It's just him and Dönitz, Admiral Dönitz, who is the final Führer of the Third Reich. He's there till I think he dies in 1980. And then, of course, everyone's favorite Nazi, Albert Speer, the good Nazi, the one who was a political animal, who was able to spin it and play the game and basically play the Nuremberg trial like a fiddle and rehabilitate himself as a good chap who did nothing wrong. He is released in 1981 to commence a career of grifting. Hess is diagnosed with prostate cancer in 1979. Doesn't really, he's already very old. It's just kind of just added to the pile of things wrong with him. I'll put up a picture of him here, old Hess. And again, this evokes that image of him being, just someone's kindly old grandpa. That's not a Nazi. That's just some old man rotting in a prison. Adherents to the Peace Party conspiracy theory claim that the reason Hess was left to rot in Spandau long after Dönitz dies and Speer is released is because the British wanted to keep the Peace Party a secret. They feared he would talk. Wolf Rudiger, Hess's son, buys into this, and it's a big part of his campaigns throughout the 70s and 80s to have his father released on compassionate grounds. The reality is, and again, we know this from actual evidence to classified documents, the British government petitions Moscow on several occasions in the 70s and 80s to release him, but they refuse. And the reason why is it serves their purpose to have this living totem of the Nazis still there. It also helps that Spandau is in West Berlin. The way that Spandau is guarded is a rotation of the Allied powers, so Russian troops get to man it at times. It ticks all the boxes in terms of Soviet propaganda. This is why Putin still evokes Nazis to this day. Nazis are useful for the Russians, very useful. So having him there is a great propaganda thing. They want him to be there till the day he dies, and that he does. On the 17th of August, 1987, he dies via asphyxiation. He seems to have committed suicide in the greenhouse at Spandau. By this stage, the only thing he's really got going on is he totters out to the greenhouse, tends to some plants. And then one day he attaches a piece of wire, I think it is, or it's a rubber hose, something like that, around his neck, and then attaches it to a hook on the wall and leans forward until he's asphyxiated. Now, obviously, this all looks a bit skewy. It feeds into the conspiracy theories that he's been murdered because he's about to be released and the truth will be known. And there's a little bit of circumstantial evidence about that. One of the coroner's reports says that his wounds are not consistent with a suicide, and that's been clung to. I don't know what to make of that. This is an old, broken man who's been suffering from mental illness for some years.
I think if someone was going to murder him, clobber him, they'd have done it earlier.
You would think so, wouldn't you?
Why, if you're going to go to that effort, why wait till he's the age he was? Because I mentioned jokingly the Wild Geese 2 film, which the whole plot of that film was that they were going to get him out of prison for him to then reveal all the truth, whatever the truth is we didn't know by the 1980s about the Nazi Party. But clearly, he wouldn't be able to tell anybody anything about the Third Reich that they didn't already know and know intimate detail. So that makes no sense to me. And I know you're going to ask me about his legacy and everything like that. And it's very complicated because I like to use the difference between the words sympathy and empathy. I have empathy for a guy who spent that long incarcerated, because he wasn't the worst of the Nazis. He wasn't a good guy. Please don't think I'm saying he's a good guy. As I said, he's a mastermind of the whole ideology. But when you have people like, I don't know, Kurt Meyer murdering soldiers who's released after 11 years in prison, and Carl Student and all these other, we could list all the people who were far, far worse murderers than he was, who don't get justice served on them. The whole war crimes procedure I've been tackling on my channel. We'll be doing it again going into next year. It's very complicated. Justice was done, or rather protocol and due process was followed, but I don't know that justice was quite achieved.
That's a good way to put it.
I think everyone was trying so hard to not be like the people that we were trying, and to make sure everything was black and white and open, and are you sure this is the right way, and let's have another committee to discuss this, and are we sure we're not doing this, and that it ends up being slightly ineffectual.
No, I mean, Nuremberg was incredibly flawed on multiple levels, and the sentences
massive understatement, but yeah, absolutely, I agree completely.
Breaking news: historian says that Nuremberg is flawed.
Yes.
But I think the reason why Hess kind of ends up getting the short end of the stick there was a couple of reasons. The first is he's an easy target. He is still on paper the Deputy Führer of the Third Reich, and he's incarcerated. Also, he does serve a purpose in as much as he is a reminder of the Nazi crimes. Why he gets life, I mean, that's the thing that's always debated as compared to, as you say, these other nastier folks. I think, judging by his state of mind, they probably looked at him and said, well, what else happens to this guy? Like, what, he was already out of it when he went into Spandau. Never mind when he's an old man. This idea that he could be released in the 1980s and spout all these secrets. If he remembered any of this, no one would believe him.
Yeah.
I
think it's interesting. I'm going into another rabbit hole of how we treat serial killers who are diagnosed as being mentally ill. Ed Gein, for example, compared to Jeffrey Dahmer or whoever it would be, or is that I can imagine the worldwide outrage if he had been put into some sort of hospital for the rest of his life. He said, look, this guy is bonkers. He's absolutely, we're going to try and find out why he's bonkers. We're going to try and treat him for this. And, I should really not use the word bonkers because it's not a medical word, is it? I mean, he's obviously, as you said there's some kind of anxiety thing going on there, OCD. Is he on the spectrum somewhere? Is he just literally kind of going mad or has gone mad, whatever? But I think the public would have not really liked the idea of him being put into some sort of mental care facility. People could, but he's an architect of the Third Reich.
Yeah.
So I think the fact he was still in prison was the better thing for if he was a victim, he was a victim of that, but not a victim of misjustice in a sense, if that makes sense.
I get what you're saying. Yeah, I think you're dead right. And if I recall correctly, some of the exchanges between the British government and the Soviets, it is along these lines of saying, well, can't we put him somewhere nicer, basically, where he can be looked after? And they're like, well, no, we can't do that because he's fucking Nazi. So, yeah, it's not necessarily the ideal situation, and it's certainly not something that seems like justice in some ways, but it is nonetheless his fate. And the fact that becomes his fate, the fact that even after the flight, he's still this enduring, mysterious figure. Why is he in Spandau? Why him? It just feeds the fire of these conspiracy theories, which continue. And the other thing, just to sort of close this out, I guess, is to think more about the myths in general. I mean, your show, you must encounter this all the time. We love Nazi myths. We love the idea that Hitler is into the occult, that they had all these super weapons that never got to be unleashed, that they went to the moon and we never knew, and UFOs are out of the Nazi experimental weapons program, all this kind of stuff. There is something about the swastika and the unknown that we just love to connect. And I think Hess is the living embodiment of that. He was such a out there figure. His flight to Scotland is arguably one of the most bizarre things that happens in the Second World War. His incarceration has lots of question marks about it. What was the purpose of it? Why was he there so long, etc.? And the sensationalism of all that, to come full circle, does, I think, obscure the fact that he was a nasty fucker. And that's what we've always got to keep in mind. He was also an unrepentant Nazi till the day he died. Like, he never even made a show of saying, well, what we did was kind of wrong. Hitler might have been wrong about stuff. He is still into this stuff well into the 1970s. He tries to sneak out, I think it's a speech about defending Nazi war aims to Oswald Mosley in the 60s, I think it is, something like that. Like, he's still fully into this, fully invested in this.
And yet, in a weird way, I kind of respect the unrepentant ones for at least not pretending that they were never into it. You know,
the Speer thing.
You mentioned, yeah, I was going to say Speer is the, well, I was never part of this. Well, but you were though, weren't you? I mean, it's the fact that Hess was still being racist to people in you know, he didn't have a big circle of people he was in contact with in Spandau, and yet he's still being abusive to people who are below him, class-wise or color-wise, or whatever it would be, is testament to his unbending hatred of people. But also, at the same time, kind of, I can buy into the fact, well, at least he's honest. He's honest about it.
He's honest about who he is.
But your question about the fact that people are obsessed about the occult and the thing is because it's easy. It doesn't. People who get into that don't have to question themselves. And I think the problem I feel is that when you start reading seriously about the creation of the Third Reich, be it Richard Overy or Frank McDonough, his three-volume series, people like that, you know, the William Brewer, blah, 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 is that you end up questioning yourself. You end up thinking, how did a theoretically normal society allow this to happen? You start feeling bad about the future, bad about the past, bad about what we are as human beings. That's what happens to me when I read about that. I'm aghast at how barbaric humans can be to each other. I'm aghast at how stupid ideas can get sold. But you don't have to go to more than level 1 or 2 of kind of emotional involvement to get involved in the idea that, oh, Hitler had to plan to have a moon base alpha or something like that, or the Atlantis so-and-so. It's easy to just dive into that to a very cursory degree, think you're being cool, think you're being progressive, think you're part, you've got some secret that no one else has. And it makes you cool. And I think that's the problem with studying the Third Reich seriously, is it's very, very depressing. You know, you don't go, when I go on holiday, I love World War II. I love reading about World War II. I don't take a big, why did the Nazis take over the world book when I'm going on holiday. I want to read an SAS book. I want to read about people going and doing things to make the world a better place, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think there's part of that ends up being involved in it. And people, as you say, people just love the idea of a conspiracy. They love the idea of something not being what it is. And what we really have is a mentally ill, evil person who makes a really bad judgment call and then ends up, through partly his own fault and partly circumstances, becoming 5 decades later a political pawn between the West and the East. He becomes the last man standing of a regime, and yet the weirdest last man standing.
Yeah, exactly, and that sums it up really well. You know, he is the oddball fanatical Nazi at the start. He's the oddball fanatical Nazi at the end. The stuff in between, a lot of question marks, a lot of stuff to hang on and extrapolate conspiracy theories from. But fundamentally, that's this guy's story, and that is why he makes for a hell of a history's devil. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining me on this odyssey through the life of the last Nazi, as he's sometimes known. And thank you, dear listener and indeed viewer, for partaking of this. Paul, do you want to plug anything while you're here?
Well, just if you haven't already, find my YouTube channel, World War II TV, where we're always discussing all aspects of World War II, from social, military, cultural, legacies, individuals, you name it, we're doing it. I'll be hitting 2,000 live streams some point in spring 2020. I was going to say 1945. I live in World War II. I can't even get my dates right. 2026, I will hit 2,000 live streams, which is extraordinary.
Good grief. That sounds exhausting, but it's a great channel. Yes, anyone listening to this, do check it out, and do continue to check us out. Follow us on Spotify, the YouTube, all those places. Hit likes and do subscribes and comments and all that stuff that you're meant to do. And thank you once again for listening to History's Devils.